Imagine creating a government because you fear power, then watching that government become one of the most powerful institutions on Earth.
America began with a warning. No kings, no unchecked authority, no government strong enough to crush the people.
But there was a problem. A government too weak to become a tyranny might also be too weak to survive.
So the founders created a political machine filled with rival branches, competing interests, elections, courts, vetoes, and constitutional limits. A system deliberately designed to fight with itself. And somehow, that conflict was supposed to protect freedom. But did it? Because behind America's celebrated ideals lies a darker story. A story of rebellion, compromise, civil war, excluded citizens, secret scandals, and an unfinished battle over who truly holds power.
The president, Congress, the Supreme Court, or the people?
The answer has changed again and again. This is the history of American government and the dangerous contradiction hidden at its center. Before the United States had a president, Congress, or constitution, it had a king. Britain's American colonies governed many local affairs, but Parliament and the Crown still claimed ultimate authority. Then came new taxes, tighter control, and a question that transformed political frustration into revolution. How could a government tax people who had no representatives in that government? Taxation without representation became more than a slogan. It became an accusation.
The colonists were not merely arguing about money. They were arguing about consent. Could a distant government rule people without their approval? Britain said yes. The revolutionaries said no. And in 1776, they made one of history's boldest political claims. Governments receive their legitimate power from the consent of the governed. But here is the first twist. The men declaring that all people were created equal lived in a society where slavery remained legal, women could not vote, and political power largely belonged to property-owning white men. America's founding promise was revolutionary. Its reality was deeply unequal. That contradiction would haunt the government for generations.
After winning independence, the states faced an urgent question. What would replace British rule? Their first answer was the Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles, America had no powerful national executive and no strong federal court system. Congress could request money from the states, but it could not effectively force them to provide it. The states behaved less like members of one nation and more like suspicious allies. That was intentional. The revolutionaries had just fought a centralized empire. They did not want to build another one. But fear created weakness. The nation struggled to pay its debts. Trade disputes divided the states. Economic instability spread, and internal unrest exposed how difficult it was for the government to respond. America had defeated the British Empire. Now it was in danger of collapsing under the weight of its own independence.
The founders had escaped tyranny, but had they accidentally created chaos? In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia. Officially, they were supposed to repair the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they decided to replace the entire system. The meeting was conducted in secrecy. Windows remained closed despite the brutal summer heat. The delegates wanted freedom to debate, and they did not want the public watching every disagreement. Inside that room, they confronted a terrifying problem. How do you make government strong enough to function without making it strong enough to dominate? Their answer was not trust, it was conflict. Power would be separated among three branches. Congress would write laws. The president would enforce them. The courts would interpret them. Each branch would have tools to limit the others. The president could veto legislation. Congress could override a veto, control funding, and remove federal officials through impeachment and conviction. Courts could eventually strike down laws that violated the Constitution. This became the American system of checks and balances. But the Constitution did not eliminate power. It divided power and encouraged those divisions to compete. The founders were betting that ambition could restrain ambition. The Constitution is often described as a masterpiece of compromise, but not every compromise was noble. Large and small states fought over representation. The result created two chambers of Congress. In the House of Representatives, population would determine representation. In the Senate, every state would receive equal representation. But another conflict was even more explosive: slavery. Southern states wanted enslaved people counted when political representation was calculated, even though those same people had no political rights. The resulting 3/5 compromise counted enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a person for representation and taxation. It did not grant them 3/5 of freedom. It increased the political power of the states holding them in bondage. The new government was founded on liberty while protecting a system built on human captivity. That contradiction was not resolved in Philadelphia. It was postponed, and the cost of that delay would be measured in blood. Many Americans feared the Constitution gave the federal government too much power. They demanded explicit protections. The result was the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. It protected freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. It addressed criminal procedure, unreasonable searches, punishment, and the balance of authority between the federal government, the states, and the people. But words on paper do not automatically defend themselves. Every right depends on interpretation. What counts as free speech? When can the government conduct a search? How much authority belongs to the states? And who decides? Over time, one institution would gain enormous influence over those questions: the Supreme Court. The Constitution created the court, but the court would help determine what the Constitution actually meant. George Washington became the first president under the Constitution, but even during his administration, political divisions appeared. One side favored a stronger national government. The other feared centralized authority and defended state power. The founders often warned against factions. Then they formed factions of their own. America's political parties were born not because the system failed, but because disagreement was built into the system itself. Soon, elections became fierce struggles over the nation's identity. Who should vote? Who should govern? Should the federal government be powerful or limited? Should America prioritize order, liberty, equality, property, expansion, or democracy? These arguments never disappeared. They simply changed names. During the 1800s, voting rights expanded for many white men who did not own property. American democracy was becoming broader, but only for some. Women remained politically excluded. Enslaved people had no freedom. Native nations were forced from ancestral lands as the United States expanded westward. The government spoke the language of democracy while using its authority to remove, conquer, and exclude. Then the question of slavery became impossible to contain. Would newly added states permit it? Could the federal government restrict it? Did states have the right to leave the Union? For decades, politicians searched for compromises. Each one bought time. None removed the cause. And in 1861, the system broke. 11 southern states attempted to secede, and the Civil War began. The conflict was a fight over the survival of the Union, and slavery was central to the rupture. President Abraham Lincoln dramatically expanded federal authority during the emergency. The war transformed the meaning of American government. The Union's victory preserved the nation. Slavery was abolished through the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment established national citizenship and promised equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment prohibited denying voting rights on the basis of race. On paper, America had been reborn, but freedom written into the Constitution did not produce freedom in daily life. After Reconstruction, discriminatory laws, racial terror, voter suppression, and segregation denied Black Americans many of the rights they had supposedly gained. The Constitution had changed. The balance of power had changed. But the struggle was far from over. This was a new understanding of government. Freedom was no longer framed only as protection from government. For many Americans, freedom also required action by government, economic security, public infrastructure, and safeguards against disaster. But every new power raised an old question: who guards the government itself? By the late 1800s and early 1900s, industrialization had transformed the country. Corporations grew larger, cities expanded, wealth accumulated at extraordinary levels. Dangerous workplaces and political corruption triggered demands for reform. Government was increasingly expected to regulate business, protect workers, improve public health, and confront monopoly power. Then came the Great Depression. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, unemployment devastated families, and millions of Americans began asking whether government had a responsibility to rescue the economy. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal expanded federal programs, regulations, public works, and social protections. To supporters, the federal government had become a lifeline. To critics, it had become dangerously powerful. This was a new understanding of government. Freedom was no longer framed only as protection from government. For many Americans, freedom also required action by government, economic security, public infrastructure, and safeguards against disaster. But every new power raised an old question: who guards the government itself? During wars and national emergencies, presidential power often expanded. Some expansions were presented as necessary for survival. Others produced grave injustice. During World War II, the federal government forcibly removed and incarcerated people of Japanese ancestry, most of them American citizens, without individual evidence of disloyalty. Fear had overwhelmed constitutional principles, and it revealed something disturbing. Rights can appear strongest during peaceful times, yet matter most during moments of panic. After World War II, the United States emerged as a global superpower. The national security state expanded, intelligence agencies grew, and presidents gained greater influence over foreign affairs. The office created to avoid monarchy was becoming more powerful than the founders could have imagined. In the 1950s and 1960s, the civil rights movement forced America to confront the gap between its democratic language and its discriminatory reality. Activists marched, organized, boycotted, registered voters, endured violence, and demanded that the government enforce the Constitution's promises. Federal courts challenged segregation. Congress passed major civil rights and voting legislation. The federal government acted against discriminatory state systems. This changed the balance between national and state authority once again. For generations, states' rights had often been used to defend racial segregation. Now federal power was being used to dismantle it. The same government that had once protected slavery and tolerated segregation was now being pressured to defend civil rights. Government was not inherently a force for freedom or oppression. It could become either. The outcome depended on laws, institutions, leadership, public pressure, and who was allowed to participate. Then came Watergate. A break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters led investigators toward President Richard Nixon's administration. The scandal uncovered abuses of power, attempts to obstruct the investigation, and secret White House recordings. The story became a test of the entire constitutional system. Could a president place himself above the law? Congress investigated. The courts intervened. Journalists pursued the evidence. The Supreme Court ordered Nixon to surrender the recordings. Facing likely impeachment and removal, Nixon resigned in 1974. The checks and balances had worked, but the scandal left behind a wound. Millions of Americans became more suspicious of their government, and that distrust would shape politics for decades.
Thinking. So who controls the American government? At first, the answer seems obvious. Authority. The president commands enormous attention. Congress controls legislation and public spending. The Supreme Court can reshape the meaning of constitutional rights. The states possess powers of their own. Mystery. But the unexpected truth is this: no single institution fully controls the system. That is both its greatest protection and its greatest weakness. Sophisticated American government was not designed for speed, simplicity, or harmony. It was designed to make power difficult to concentrate. That produces stability, but also gridlock. It can stop a dangerous leader. It can also delay urgent reform. It can protect minority rights from a temporary majority. But throughout history, it has also allowed powerful minorities to block change. Gravity. The system does not automatically create justice. It creates a battlefield on which justice must be demanded. Discovery. And here is the deeper reveal. The Constitution is not the entire government. Government is also precedent, tradition, institutions, political parties, public opinion, protest movements, media, elections, and the decisions of millions of ordinary people. Thoughtful. The written rules matter, but so do the people interpreting and challenging them. Soft. The story of American government is not a straight march toward freedom. It is a struggle between ideals and reality, between national power and state authority, between security and liberty, between majority rule and individual rights, between those who possess power and those demanding to be heard. History. The government began as an experiment. It survived rebellion, civil war, economic collapse, global conflict, presidential scandal, social upheaval, and repeated crises of trust. Warning: but survival does not guarantee justice, and age does not guarantee permanence. Every generation inherits the same unfinished question. Can a government become powerful enough to protect its people without becoming powerful enough to control them? The founders could not answer that question forever. Neither can presidents, judges, or members of Congress. Inspirational. Because the final safeguard was never supposed to be a building in Washington. It was supposed to be an informed public, one willing to question authority, defend the rights of others, and refuse to treat democracy as a spectator sport. Quiet. American government is often described as a machine, but machines operate on their own. Democracy does not. Action. It must be watched. It must be challenged. It must be repaired. Warning. And if the people stop paying attention, the system will not simply freeze. Someone else will take control. Hope. The history of American government is still being written, and whether its next chapter moves toward greater freedom or away from it depends on who chooses to hold the pen.